here to hear the story of a remarkable woman, Mamie George Williams, told by a remarkable woman, Velma Maia Thomas. Velma's a public historian and the author of several nonfiction books, including Least We Forget, The Passage from Africa to Slavery and Emancipation, Freedom's Children, and We Shall Not Be Moved. From 1987 to 2000, Velma served as the manager of the Shrine of the Black Madonna Cultural Center and Bookstore in Atlanta, where she created the nationally acclaimed Black Holocaust exhibit, a collection of original documents on slavery and resistance in America. In early 2012, Velma was selected as a subject expert for the PBS documentary Underground Railroad, The William Tell Story, which continues to air nationally. Her work, The Odd Fellow City, The Promise of a Leading Black Town, was published in the 2012 edition of the Journal of Georgia Association of Historians. Velma's research, Your Advertisement Troubles Me, Atlanta's Gold Dust Twins, has been published online, and an interview with her aired in 2015 on that work. Her latest work, Getting Everything of Value Out of It for the Race, explores the contribution of Mamie George Williams, once the highest-ranking Republican leader in Georgia. Velma's been researching Mamie and her work and getting her story out for quite some time. She's created a coalition to support her in that effort, and the Juliette Gordon Low Birthplace is proud to join Delta Sigma Theta, the Savannah Tribune, the League of Women Voters, the City of Savannah Archives, and Girl Scouts of Historic Georgia in that effort. So join me in welcoming Velma.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I need to put this mic on. Is that good? Yeah. Thank you for joining me this evening. I am happy to be here and happy to talk about Mamie George Williams. Anybody familiar with her? Oh, good. Okay, we have some people. So I'm going to pass this around while I speak so we can read. And we do have these posters out front for people who would like to make a donation. When I started doing research on Mamie George Williams, I did not start to do research on Mamie George Williams. I was looking at another individual, Benjamin Davis, who was head of the Odd Fellows for the state of Georgia. And he had a newspaper. And this woman's name just kept popping up. And I said, who is this woman who is just a thorn in this man's side? And so I began to look at her, and you know, if you're a researcher, it's easy to get off track. You start and then you say, okay, put a pin in it, come back to it. So I did decide to come back to Mamie George Williams, and I am so glad that I did. So Mamie George Williams was a towering figure, a noted civic and political leader in the early 20th century. A native and lifelong resident of Savannah, she held leadership positions in local and national women's clubs, served as a member of the Interracial Commission for Georgia, rose to become Georgia's ranking member of the Republican Party, and established a school and home for African American girls. To many, Williams was the Esther of her people, a woman who stood before the ruling powers of her day. Williams called out political traitors, advanced causes, marked victories, and bore defeat. Today, few speak her name. Yet for a time, Mamie Williams stood tall among African American leaders, determined to extract from what she called the smudge of politics everything of value for the race. Now, one can say that Mamie was born a privilege, as much as an African American could be a privilege just 7 years after the Civil War. Born in April 1872, although her death certificate adds a later date, but you know, we seem to get younger as we get older. So I can understand that. She was born to James and Sarah Miller, religious leaders here in Savannah, and was given the name Mary Frances. She was called Mamie. She completed her early education at Beach Institute, we're all familiar with Beach Institute, and was a member of First Congregational Church here. She was a graduate of the Atlanta University, thus educated and refined. She married George S. Williams, a noted educator and businessman in Savannah, who died in 1915. Throughout her early years of her career, she was known as Mrs. George S. Williams, later being recognized in her own right as Mrs. Mamie Williams, and to her closest friends, Mamie George. So you can imagine how difficult it was to do this research. I had to look up all these names because often we were just attached to our husbands. So I'm looking up Mamie George, and I'm looking up Miss Mamie George Williams, and I'm looking up this and that. But she stood out, and pretty soon, as people began to know more about her, that George Williams dropped, and she became Mamie. Williams believed in civic engagement, a value perhaps instilled in her by her parents or her years at Atlanta University. During World War I, Williams demonstrated her patriotism, supporting liberally loan drives that provided crucial material and emotional support for Black troops engaged in the war camp. Her 2,400 hours of volunteer work, her 2,400 hours of volunteer work with Toussaint L'Ouverture branch of the American Red Cross earned her a coveted pen. Wouldn't you love to have a volunteer like that? A fair-complexioned woman with auburn hair, Mamie appeared white to some, drawing some raised eyebrows at one meeting of African-American women. A woman of independent means, Mamie. She owned her home, several here in Savannah, and was known to, as they say, motor to Long Island, New York, to her second home. Social service and politics were her life's calling. She would make a profound impact in both areas. The year 1920 was historic as states ratified the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. Williams rolled up her sleeves and with an unmatched zeal, set out to register women in Georgia, particularly African-American women. According to one newspaper, she registered so many colored women in Georgia that the governor of the state stopped registration of all women until some legislation could be passed. She joined the Women's Suffrage Club of Chatham County, that was a Black group, serving as a member of its executive committee. The club held forums at local churches, invited political leaders to speak to women on the process of voting, took a census of every woman of voting age, and held mock elections. Concerned with the general well-being of African Americans, the club promoted literacy and established night schools for adults. She was a busy woman. She was serious about voting. From 1920 to 1924, Williams held the post of vice president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, setting national policies and agendas. Her contemporaries included Mary Church Terrell, activist and first president of the association, Ida Wells Barnett, fiery journalist and anti-lynching crusader, Maggie Lena Walker, a woman of her race who chartered a bank, and Mary McLeod Bethune, founder of Daytona Normal and Industrial Institute, later known as the Bethune-Cookman College. In fact, there is a picture of her standing next to Mary McLeod Bethune. This is a 1936 photo of Black women leaders. Active in voter education, she rose through Georgia's Republican ranks. Now she, as thousands of other African Americans at that time, voted the Republican ticket. That was the party of Lincoln that freed the enslaved. Williams was mentored by Henry Link Johnson, a revered National Republican committeeman from Georgia. And I think it's important to understand the shift in the politics, because now people, when I say she was Republican, it was like, but I say no, Black people were Republicans at the turn of the century. So we had Black people, particularly men who held particularly strong positions in the Republican Party. Henry Link Johnson was one of those men. His brilliant argument against the lily-white Republicans who vowed to unseat Black Republican leaders were legendary. The lily-whites were a faction of the Republican Party that said we do not want Black leadership. They were opposed by the Black and Tans, basically the black group and some whites who said, no, we're going to keep Blacks in the party. So you'll hear these words, lily white, and you'll hear Black and tan. She met and at times bittered with Benjamin Davis, the gentleman whom I did my first research on. He was a shrewd politician. She supported the party and was said to bring out 40,000 Georgia women to vote in the 1920 presidential election. And she waged a voters campaign in 160 Georgia counties at that time from her headquarters in Atlanta. She flooded the state with literature, she made speeches, and she picketed polling places. I like to say, you go, Miss Mamie. Can y'all say that for me? You go, Miss Mamie. Mamie was rewarded for her dedication and hard work. In 1924, the Republican Party adopted the 50-50 rule, stipulating that women must comprise 50% of the Republican National Committee.
Wow.
Oh, you like that? Yeah. With the 50-50 rule in place, Republican National Committeeman Henry Link Johnson took this opportunity to place a Black woman in this position of power. He appointed Mamie Williams committee woman for Georgia. And that year, 1924, Mamie Williams became the first woman from Georgia and the first African-American woman in the country to serve on the Republican National Committee. You go, Miss Mamie. You go, Miss Mamie. This is important. As I go back and do the research, I think they called these women, they were on the advisory committee. Something like that. In other words, just sit and watch us. You know, we'll show you how to do this thing. So they act like they weren't real committee people, but they were, because you know, women, we're gonna step up anyway. When William was appointed, all the Black press applauded. The headlines of the Pittsburgh Courier read, Georgia woman, associate member of the National Committee. Miss George S. Williams, first to sit on the National Committee of her party. The Chicago Defender recorded, club leaders selected of GOP ranks. Miss George S. Williams wins high honors. The 50-50 rule was a boost for all women, but race prejudice kept some women from celebrating. But Mamie wasn't finished with that. She had another victory coming. At the convention, she scored another first. She became the first woman in U.S. political history given the floor at the Republican National Convention. Now, I had to read that a couple of times because I said, well, maybe she was not the first woman, maybe the first African-American woman. But this one reporter said, when she spoke, who acknowledged her, and I said, I can't really argue this. So here we have this African-American woman who's the first to represent Georgia, the first to be on the National Committee, and the first woman to rise and stand and speak at a convention. You go, Miss Mamie. Immediately after the 1924 convention, she made history again. She convened other prominent women and established the National Republican League of Colored Women, the first and only national political organization among African-American women in the U.S. This is Savannah's jewel. This is why I push her. This is why I wish she was Atlanta's jewel. But she is not. She is your jewel. Politics again would engulf Miss Mamie. In 1925, upon the death of her mentor, she became the highest-ranking African-American Republican in Georgia. She singularly held the reign of power until 1926, when Davis was replaced to name Johnson. So now she's the big dog. She's the big boss. She rose to power during the years of the Hoover administration, a time when Black Republicans were fighting for their political lives. The administration will be remembered as one that stripped Black Republicans of power, ridding the power of what they call corrupt Black and tan leaders, so that the party would appeal to Southern whites. Williams juggled an on-again, off-again relationship with candidate and later President Herbert Hoover. Early, she appeared to be his confidant. In 1928, and I love this story, during a brief stop in Savannah, then presidential candidate Hoover sought out Williams, inviting the National Committee woman as a guest in his private car. And you got to say, you go, Miss Mamie. It was a gesture to win her confidence and support and to woo Negro leaders. Yet the Republican Party began to show its contempt for Black leaders. After Hoover gained the nomination, the Republican Party accelerated its whitewashing of the party. Hoover was disturbed by reports of Black and tan leaders that they were selling federal appointments. The Pittsburgh Courier reminded the Republican Party that federal appointments are sold and bought by parties of the highest bidder. In other words, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. If Negro politicians have received any funds for carrying out their work, they have but followed the policy of politicians since time immemorial, a policy that will be just as easily followed by their white successors, if any. Despite some reservations of Hoover, Williams and other committee members threw their support behind him, helping him secure the party's nomination and the 1928 presidential election. Black Republicans were rewarded with invitations to the inauguration, making the first time in history that a contingency of African Americans was given first-class treatment at the White House. Leading Black politicians, including Williams, poured into the inaugural gallery. One reporter, she was with the, she had the social beat. She wrote, "It is difficult to say when Washington has been as gay or has made such elaborate preparations for an inauguration as for the inauguration of Herbert Hoover. A galaxy of dances, parties, teas, suppers, musical banquets, and receptions and whatnot makes it impossible to describe sanely the social activity in Washington during this past week. One sees Dr. Albert Johnson and Phyllis arriving early in the morning. Fern Hopkins stepping down from the Red Arrow, wearing a coat trimmed with luxurious lace collar. Miss Grace Kellogg and her charming daughter Muriel dashing madly from engagement to engagement. Miss Sarah Arnold in a blue gown. Mrs. George S. Williams arriving at the White House reception with the official family. Politicians close in conversation regarding the Black cabinet, more visitors arriving. They were received in the Blue Room and enjoyed dinner in the State Dining Room and sat at the dais during the parade. Said the Philadelphia Tribune, this was the first time that members of the race have been recipients of social favors since the Roosevelt administration, during the time Booker T. Washington was a frequent visitor and received similar courtesies. And when I read that, I was just astounded. I said, I haven't heard about Black people coming to the White House in 1928, 1929, being received, coming in, sitting at the dais, and Mamie Williams was right there. She was right there, up front and center. Social gaieties, however, soon ended. The Republican Party executed the plan to unseat Black leaders and their white supporters. A senior committee person from Georgia, Williams sought out the patronage privilege due her. That's the privilege to recommend people for federal jobs. Hoover viewed all Black Southern Republican leaders as unsavory and set out to replace them with respectable whites. Williams, who had never been accused of mishandling anything, wrote letter after letter to President Hoover. Her appeals were ignored or rebuffed. In September 1929, Williams visited President Hoover at the White House. Now, anybody read about that in your history books? No, she visited him at the White House. The African-American press speculated that the visit centered on her request to handle federal patronage in Georgia. Remaining faithful to the party, Williams refused to reveal what she said during her conference with the president. But the outcome spoke for itself. Instead of granting Williams patronage power, a committee of men was named to dispose federal jobs in Georgia. The press gave its answer as to why. They said Mamie Williams' record is clean. No taint of corruption is charged against her. The only reason that can be assigned for no consideration being shown her is that she is colored. And I wish I could have found what she said. See, they said about Mamie she could be neither bullied nor cajoled. So I don't think she spoke softly. I think she spoke loudly and carried a big stick. But being a lady and true to the era of the time, she would not reveal. Williams, as did other members of the Black and Tan faction, witnessed Hoover's determination to lily white the Republican Party. Fearless, Williams spoke her piece at a banquet of 100 guests at the Stop Lynching League. She scolded the president and warned of the downfall of the party if it continued to fail to protect and nourish its Black wing. She warned white leadership was not only impossible, but suicidal and treacherous as it goes against Republican principles. Nonetheless, she reaffirmed her dedication to politics, to the enfranchisement of Black women, and to the tenets of the Republican Party. She said, to many, politics is a sordid game. But to me, it means the getting of everything worthwhile out of it for the race. With the granting of the franchise to women, several million colored women were added to the electorate, and they entered the political world with the knowledge gleaned from 60 years' experience of all forms of labor, occupying as she does the least favorable position on the economic scale. The colored woman is the first to feel the blow of unemployment, the first to feel the increased cost of food. Because of these, she should be interested in politics. She did not shy away from the faults of both parties regarding an increasing of lynchings in the South. Not one voice of protest, she asserted, has come from the head of our government. The entire nation seems to have gone to sleep in regards to the heinous crime of lynching. And at this point, I'd like to note that in March of 2022, President Biden signed into law the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. You all familiar with that? It got very little press. It was a bill that made lynching a federal hate crime. It took more than 100 years for Congress to pass such a bill. The first bill was introduced in 1980. It took that kind of time. I'm sure Mamie would be pleased, upset that it took so long, but pleased that it happened. So there included a lot of infighting on the state level, pitting Ben Davis and the Lily Whites against Williams and the Black and Tans. I mean, these two were going at it. The Lily White Republicans held a state conference in South Georgia to which no blacks were invited. Yet they claimed to be the representation of the party. Williams and her faction would not be denied. At a state convention in April 1932, she unleashed a torrent of criticism among Georgia's Lily White entourage, including of being no more or less than a bunch of tricksters, fake Republicans, and job seekers. She called her own state convention. Sometimes we have to do that, right? I'm gonna call my own state convention. A biracial committee, and was voted in to represent the state Republican National Convention. In 1932, she took this fight to Chicago, to the National Convention, arguing that her faction was the only duly elected delegates representative of the people. No one gave her the respect a National Committee woman deserved. In her zeal, she spoke over her time. The roar of laughter from the committee and the spectators made it difficult for the chairman's gavel to be heard. Williams appealed to the committee to make their decisions 100% American by putting a little color into it and seating her delegation. Her words fell on deaf ears. The Credentials Committee recognized the Lily White faction. James Arnold White, a former Democrat and a man once associated with the Ku Klux Klan, was recognized as a committee man. And Ms. Bertha Fields of Marietta, was nominated to succeed Williams as National Committee woman. She was out. Williams arose when Arnold's name was presented, and in a dramatic and courageous fashion protested it as a repudiation of the colored membership of the party of the state, and warned the move represented the domination of the Lily White leaders over the Republicans in the South. This was a woman who spoke her mind. She was not afraid. We have to say, you go, Miss Mamie. Reported the Baltimore African Americans, she stood there in the highest body of the Republican Party like a lone reed in the wilderness, with a vibrant note of sincerity ringing from her voice. She pleaded for recognition of the masses of the party in the South, but not another voice was raised to support her protest. Anybody been there? You stand up for something, you got your back up, and you look back, they're gone, they backed out the door, they backed away. I'm with you. When you stand up for right, sometimes it's lonely. Despite failing to gain the nomination for committee woman, she held her head high and spoke her truth. Perhaps in an attempt to appease her, the party placed her name on a planning committee. Now that's some nerve. You oust me, then you're going to use my name for your purposes. Williams soundly objected, declaring that she had no intent of supporting Hoover and that her name had been used without her permission. She called herself Exhibit A of colored citizens who have been victims of the Republican Party. She said the stench of Lily Whiteism raises to the high heavens, and unless President Hoover is loud and bold against the principles, no thoughtful or honest colored man or woman can support him. She also pointed to the president's failure to condemn disenfranchisement, segregation, and discrimination in government departments, and failure to ensure that colored workers got their quota of jobs and work fostered by the government. So she was just fighting mad that time. She just called them out for everything that they didn't do. So she was nearing the end of her political career. In 1932, at the close of her career, the Atlanta Daily World thanked Williams for her impeccable service. They wrote a modern Esther, pleading for her people. She knew no compromise, accepted no quarter. Miss Williams will go down in history as a champion saint of her people, with her hands unstained and her conscience clear, that with the consolation that in no time did the temptation in its glaring disguise move her to deliver her people and her party for 30 pieces of silver. I'm sure upon defeat, Williams asked herself, what now? You may have been there, I have. You give all to an organization, to a cause, you suffer a defeat or a setback or a life-altering change. She could have retired from political life, but instead chose to focus her efforts back home, here in Savannah, on Black women's clubs, on African-American children. She gave the rest of her life's efforts to one cause in particular, supporting the establishment of the Negro Division of Girl Scouts, right here in Savannah. Say, you go, Miss Mamie. So you gotta bounce back, and you have to find your new call. She was well respected, well loved in New York. She had family in New York. They would open their doors, open their arms to her, but she said, no, I'm a native of Savannah, and my people need me here. In 1942, Williams and other prominent African-American women met with the leaders of the Girl Scouts. They set forth to establish troops for African-American girls. The women established an executive committee of which Mamie was named a member. The women met with Dr. B.F. Hubert, president of what today is Savannah State University, and identified a community in Hancock County of 10,000 acres owned by African Americans, and worked with the Log Cabin Center of Negro County Life Association in that community. We don't hear those stories. We don't hear about Black communities, about Black landowners, about Black people who say, no, we want something for ourselves. We want our girls to have the same privileges as the white girls. Meetings were held with the Girl Scout leadership who visited the site and made sure it met with the organization's standards. The Negro Division, Dr. Hubert stressed that Negro women were to be involved in every aspect, including the fundraising for the Girl Scout facilities. And he selected who? Mamie George Williams to head the fundraising drive. The camp opened in 1945. The Atlanta Constitution announced groundbreaking ceremonies for the Log Cabin Camp and noted it was the nation's first camp for Negro Girl Scouts. That's Mamie George. That's y'all's Mamie George. Mamie George Williams of Savannah, they said, is chairman of the committee, which raised $6,000 to finance the project. The Girl Scout camp was a huge success. The 2-week camp were arts and craft, swimming in a cement pool, y'all, in a cement pool, folk dances, outdoor cooking and hiking, exploring trails and nature observances, horseback riding. School teachers volunteered their times. Physicians offered free medical screening. A newspaper article on the opening wrote, Girl Scout Association and the Log Cabin Committee wish to thank all who helped to make this Girl Scout camp possible for these girls. In honor of her dedication, the Negro Division of the Girl Scouts named Mamie George Williams District in her honor. I thought this is so wonderful that they looked up and saw that this woman dedicated her life at this point to the Girl Scouts. So who were these early African-American Girl Scout troops? I'm going to call out a few numbers. Troop 63, Mary Haynes was the leader. Troop 62, Margaret Saunders. Troop 82, Elmer Shepard. Troop 85, Miss Willie Mae Sampson. Troop 84, Geneva Mitchell. Troop 67, Naomi James. Troop 65, Celestine Williams. Troop 71, Metella Marini, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing her name, but she worked very closely with Mamie George Williams, so she kind of picked up and took the mantle from there. Troop 81, Nancy Walker. Troop 66, Elder Davis. Troop 83, Daisy Tyson. Troop 61, Olga Dingle. Troop 63, Miss Retha Gibbs. Troop 86, Miss Mary Mitchell. And there have been many, many more. But their history is kind of like hushed, you know? So we have all these Girl Scouts here in Savannah, all these troops. And I'm sure there's still some members alive, because you do the math, they would probably be 80s in their early 90s. And so we have to resurrect them and thank them and get this going again. This is all a part of who the Girl Scouts were. Mamie George Williams continued to serve in Savannah. In 1937, she served as president of the Georgia Savings and Realty Company, known as the Carver Bank now. She was leader of the movement that established the Colored Recreation Center and swimming pool here. She established the Georgia State Training School for colored girls and served as matron in charge of the Chatham Protective Home in Thunderbolts. For several years, she held the post of daughter of the Elton, Georgia, a director of a savings bank, a trustee of Central State College in Macon, was also served as president of the Chatham County Colored Citizens Council. They call it the 5 Cs. If you look at her, she remained a Republican, but she never forgave the Republican Party for condoning that lily white policy. Mamie Williams died in 1951 at age 79. In eulogizing Williams, the editor of the Savannah Tribune wrote of her civic and social contributions. In the passing of Miss Mamie George S. Williams, Savannah has lost another citizen, loyal to it to the core, a tireless champion of her people. Perhaps none of her activities gave her more satisfaction than her work with the Chatham Protective Home for Negro Girls and her work with the Girl Scouts. Many children whom she mothered bear eloquent testimony of the devotion to the cause to which she gave in her latter years of life. Despite her accomplishments, Mamie George Williams has been lost to history. She has been recalled by only a few who have included her in broad works on women and Savannah. She broke down barriers for Black women and white women, becoming the nation's first African-American Republican committee woman and the first woman of any race given the floor at a Republican National Convention. She battled for African Americans to be heard and counted, respected in the Republican Party, often standing alone. Hers was a mothering spirit, a voice crying in the wilderness. Although battle-tested, victorious, and often scarred, she never flinched. She never gave in. She aimed in politics to get everything worthwhile out of it for the race. I think about Mamie George now, and as we head into this political season, and she would say, do the right thing, vote the right way, look down the road and see what the end is going to be. This was a woman who was well appointed. She had business deals. She had real estate. She could have sat at home and lived a very happy, comfortable life. But she decided that no, women have to be heard. So she was invited to the front porch meetings in the 20s, invited to come and hear and talk about women's issues. She was a volunteer. She never stopped. Someone asked, when did she sleep? Because if you saw that, I mean, everything, she was everywhere. She was everywhere. And I sometimes when people ask, why do you think she was lost in history? It may be because she didn't have children, no one to carry on her legacy. She had brothers and sisters, they moved to New York, but she didn't have anybody here who spoke her name. And in the African-American tradition, going back to the African tradition, we believe as long as you speak someone's name, they will be remembered. So that's why when I speak, I always say, you go, Miss Mamie. But y'all say that for me, you go, Miss Mamie. Now when you say it with some sash, you go, Miss Mamie. You go, Miss Mamie. So we want to lift her. And I know oftentimes when you stand where you stand and you look out and say, what in the world is going on today? When people just can't get along and politics is crazy, we have to realize that we are still the vanguard, that women are still the vanguard, that we are still the conscience of this nation, that we are still the judge and juror because we do that with our families every day. And that when it's time to make a move, the last thing politicians want to see is a group of women at the door. Because they know we will not stop. We will not be bullied or cajoled like Mamie. So we have to harness our energy and harness our power. And we have to think like Mamie thought. And I think sometimes she must have thought about this song. Keep your lamps trimmed and burning. Keep your lamps trimmed and burning. Keep your lamps trimmed and burning. The time is drawing nigh, so children don't get weary. Children don't get weary. Children don't get weary till our work is done. Mamie George Williams, getting everything of value out of it for the race. Thank you. We can take questions. Yes, ma'am.
Whatever happened to Ben Johnson?
Benjamin Davis.
Sorry, Benjamin Davis.
Benjamin Davis went quietly away. He remained a Republican. Maybe just said, He remained a Republican, but never regained power. Now his son, Ben Davis Jr., went to New York and became part of the Communist Party. And Ben Davis was heartbroken. He was Republican, a staunch Republican. But Ben Davis Jr. made names for himself as well. So if people in New York know about Ben Davis Jr., so he wasn't far from, the apple didn't fall far from the tree. But she never let up on him. Boy, she talked about him, how he sold out, what she said, for a porridge, She was just like, do not mention this man's name to me. And I wish they could have worked together. But like I said, this woman, her name kept coming up, and the more I read about it, and when I think I have found everything, I find something else about her. She served on the Anti-Lynching Crusade. It was a national organization that asked 1 million women to give $1 to fight lynching. And so I'm reading about someone else, and I said, well, let me see who represented Georgia. Mamie George Williams, as if I were surprised. So that's what happened to him. Mamie, I think, was she was a feisty woman, very, very much self-assured and very feminine, And so I think people may have thought, oh, she's so refined. And when she let out, when she told people what she really thought, they stood back. And they said at one point there was another, even after she left the Republican Party, there was a group that came down to Georgia, and she was, the reporter said, the only woman in the group. So she ate that up. And she drove some fantastic car while she was there. So she still remembered, who she was. She used her femininity to her advantage, as we do. She knew when to be feminine and when to be coy and when to come out and attack. So nobody ever knew where Mamie stood. They were like, okay, which way is she going today? So that's what happened to him, but she moved on, she lived on. She's buried, I didn't say that, she's buried in Lower Grove South, but we don't know where. We know where her husband is interred, and he has a monument that stands this high. We don't know where. I don't know if we ever will know where. So she's kind of lost, which is why I bring her to you all, so you all can elevate her. Any more questions? Yes.
The ratification of the suffragists were working towards women getting a vote in Georgia. And at a previous program, we heard from the League of Women Voters that Black and white women worked together up until the point that it seemed like votes for women were going to come through. And then there was a disruption because the white women felt that if they tried to get Black women in on women's rights at the same time, that they would lose everything. In your research, did you find any indication that her break with some of the women's rights groups from the early teens and the 20s led her to, pushed her in a different direction so that her leadership skills actually came out of that battle?
I think her leadership skills were recognized. Like I said, when she was invited to those front porch meetings, she may have been one of a few African-American women there. But then again, she was very fair-skinned, so she wasn't as visible. But she always stood her ground as an African-American woman. So even when she came back to Savannah, and the Black women had their own organization for women voters, she was a member of that. So I think she was very well respected by both groups, but she chose to work with the Chatham County Women's Group. And that group had its origins and met at the Carnegie Library. That's where they had their early meetings. And I'll just tell it all. And Mamie George lived on East Henry Street, just down, a few houses down from that library. So there's a lot of history right in that area. So I think she was well respected by both groups, but she chose to work with the African American group. And that group also, like as I said, reached out to help women, to also do literacy for adults. And we find where Black women did try to vote here and made headlines, they were turned away. And they also turned Mamie away. They said she was at the courthouse blocking the voters. And she was saying, I'm just showing Black women how to vote. So it depends on which newspaper you read. And so they said, well, she wasn't really arrested. We just asked her to step to the side. But I'm sure she put up a fight. I'm sure she was feisty. She just was very driven and very determined. This way.
Sorry. How would you like to see her memorialized in Savannah?
I'm glad you asked. We have been successful with my partnering groups to work with the Georgia Historical Society, and they are going to put up a historical marker for Mamie George. Yeah, and that's going to be in 2023. It will be in Dixon Park, and that's East Broad and East Henry, across the street from the Carnegie Library. That's also an area where she lived.
Oh.
And so I think it's just very fitting.
Mm-hmm.
I would also love to see and I don't know how the Girl Scouts do it, a Mamie George Williams district or something,
Or at Town Square.
Resurrected, so that when African American girls are meeting as Girl Scouts and they get their back together, they can remember her name.
Mm-hmm.
They can call her out. They can remember who she was.
I mean, she embodied so many values that the Girl Scouts also strive for. So.
And like they said, she loved the Girl Scouts, and that was her heart. That was her organization, and to raise that kind of money and that Girl Scout camp, I'm like, wow. We're talking 1945. They're doing all of this, and they went, and then they had day camps after a while. For the girls who couldn't go away for 2 weeks. And then there were girls from all around the state of Georgia who came. So this was really like an eye-opener that she and other Black women and the president of Savannah State University came together and said, no, we want our girls to have something nice too.
That was my question, is sort of like the next chapter, where is that camp? Is it a thing? Did it die? Like
It probably died, there's always a history about Black folks and land and what becomes of it. But I know there's a historic marker in that area because that African American family is very prominent. They had doctors and presidents of universities. So I don't think that association is still there, but the history of it is still can be found. Yes.
Nowadays, with the difficulty in our education system and with politicians trying to change the way history is taught in the schools to ignore race and to ignore stories of different people as contributors, how can we advocate to get stories like this told as part of the history that's taught in school without raising the ire of the politicians?
You probably can, but you have your churches, you have your organizations, you have places where you are in charge, and you can tell this story. For African Americans, we have always told our own stories. Even when after schools were integrated, we found that our stories were missing. So we told our own stories. We have to claim our own stories. Women have to claim their own stories. When they said that these women were associate members of the Republican Party committee, I said, well, we doggone, they were full-fledged members, but then they're associates. We'll tell you how to vote. But we have to tell our stories. So if we can get it in the school system, fine. But if not, then we have our own groups where we can tell these stories. Yes, ma'am.
Was anything ever done at Savannah Street
In terms of?
recognizing
Um,
her presence or relationships?
See, Mamie was active there. She taught some summer courses there, and I think Savannah State had one of the early troops. But when I reached out to their archivists, they didn't seem to have anything.
That's okay, I'm a scholar in residency. I'm sure that that starts tomorrow.
Okay. Then we will talk.
Tonight.
Okay, then you and I need to
I
talk.
will be on it.
Okay, and that's what we need.
We go way back to St. Helena.
We
were roommates.
We do. When you walked in the door, I said, well, you see, I'm still at it. So
It's okay, but no, I will be on it.
Okay.
I will work.
That's very good. And this way, when we have our the unveiling, now I'm gonna tell you, I want to, as the kids say, I want to go big or go home. So I want everybody to come. We need to pull. There are so many organizations that she touched that it's almost impossible for someone not to say, oh, I remember. She spoke at so many churches. She was involved with the Tuberculosis Society here. She was involved with the Charity Hospital. There was another hospital, Kennan Hospital, or something that started with a K here, that her husband was part of. So I don't care what you mention, if you look, you'll find her there. So when we celebrate, everybody is invited because everybody can say, oh yes, she spoke at our church. Oh yes, she was part of the Elks. Oh yes, she's in the Federation Club of Women. So all groups can come.
First congregation.
Mm-hmm. First congregation. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious if Mamie had any contact with Robert Abbott, seeing as how they were both from Savannah and both alumni of Beach Institute. Robert Abbott being the editor, publisher of the Chicago Defender. These are two people on the national stage, and I just wondered if there was any contact.
There probably was, and what I found, and I don't know if he was still editor at the time, and when she passed, that was the only newspaper that even mentioned her death, with the exception of Savannah Tribune. It was a paragraph.
How about that?
Mm-hmm. So we have to really tell these stories until people are sick of hearing them ad nauseum. Oh God, here they come again. But I think she's worthy of that. I think she really needs to be heralded, and that it's inspiring to me. It's inspiring for women who want to be in politics. It's inspiring for women who want to give back to their communities. That there's a precedent has been set. If you follow her trail and expand upon that, it'll be good for everybody. Thank you, ladies. We did have a sign-in sheet, and that's so when we have the unveiling, we would like to invite you all. And then the poster that you saw, we do have that for a donation of $5 if you would. And take that home and show it, and take it to your churches and say, we need a Mamie George Williams Day. I'm still pushing for April. April was when she was appointed by the Black Republicans to really get Black women together for the vote. And from what my research says, her birthday was probably in April. So that's a good time. So, it's kind of like in the middle of everything that's going on, but she needs to be very well known here. Because I'm telling you, if anybody else had her, like I said, if I can figure out how to make her an Atlanta person, but New York City is looking because they know, because the New York Age loved her. And when her mother died in New York, they had an article, a whole article about who she was and who her mother was, but it was a little quieter down here, and probably for some different political reasons. So I'm not pointing any fingers because I understand the South and the North are different. But that she's gaining this recognition now is encouraging, and I thank you all.